The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective. To begin, here is Yanis with the local news.
Thank you, Manolis. On January 14th, former president judge of the municipal courts, Patrick Dugan, announced his intention to run for Philadelphia's district attorney position. An unsurprising announcement, given as early as August of last year, there were reports that Dugan, then president judge, was in talks with various quote-unquote power brokers in the city about a potential run. While it's unclear the exact people party to these conversations, it is likely that he was speaking to friendly Democratic Party leadership, local capitalists, and labor unions to garner support. With sitting judges being barred from political activities like running for office, Dugan resigned last month from his position as president judge in order to run for DA. A fact which hints at the level of possible promises and assurances that he received from these quote-unquote power brokers. The former judge, in his announcement, took aim at the policies of current DA and longtime Democrat Larry Krasner, citing not being able to stand them any longer as reason for his running, saying, quote, "I had a front row seat to some of the policies that just don't make sense to me, and I couldn't take it any longer," end quote. Clearly, this election is shaping up to be a full-on confrontation between Dugan and Krasner, which on the surface may seem confusing. After all, if both are Democratic Party members, why is the party struggling for a position that they ostensibly already hold? The fact is that the Democratic Party is not a monolith, but is composed of various sections, each vying for control. Philadelphia is a Democratic Party stronghold, so the struggle for control over the city does not take the usual Republican-Democrat form. Instead, it takes the form of a struggle between two sections of the same party, the quote-unquote progressives and so-called establishment Democrats. While the balance of forces changes from issue to issue, place to place, there is an established, more conservative section that is dominant for the most part. Another less dominant but still strong section of the party is its progressive wing, which saw a surge during the progressive wave of the last decade. So, far from being a simple political struggle between two people, this struggle is in reality a power struggle between two wings of the Democratic Party over control of the judiciary in Philadelphia. To illustrate this, it will be necessary to dive into Krasner's policies over his two terms. Larry Krasner was elected as DA in 2017 under a progressive banner. He was part of a progressive wave that saw many Social Democrats and other quote-unquote progressive wing candidates elected under promises of reforms. In the case of Krasner, these were reforms to the justice system. 2017 saw a growing discontent in the working masses. Thousands took to the street to protest police brutality and the numerous examples of police killing working-class people. The Black Lives Matter movement was in full swing and had taken center stage in the people's call for a solution to the savagery they were facing. From police killings to the mass incarceration that lines the pockets of private prison capitalists, working-class people could feel the boot of the bourgeois state on their necks and were demanding change. The class struggle was reaching a pitch that would, in 3 short years, explode into the George Floyd protest, which saw a militancy in the working masses, the likes of which had not been seen for many decades. The bourgeoisie, feeling this discontent building, sought pressure valves to release this energy in ways that did not threaten their dictatorship. It was in this context that Krasner, the progressive DA, was elected. Once in office, Krasner began to implement his reforms. He ordered his assistant district attorneys to not charge those found with marijuana with possession, regardless of amount, not to charge with prostitution prostitutes who had fewer than 2 previous charges, while those with 3 or more were to be sent to a specialized court. and to offer alternatives to incarceration, for example, probation, for crimes where guidelines recommended between 0 and 2 years incarceration. Another reform, which has brought the most criticism, is his order to charge retail thefts under $500 as summary offenses instead of misdemeanors. In the years since his election, there has been a significant drop in the prison population. Since Krasner took office in 2018, there has been a 25% drop, and since 2015, there has been a 41% drop. Despite these reforms seemingly having the effect they were meant to, Krasner has begun rolling back some of these policies, likely as a response to the pressure from local capitalists, both big and small, and the looming election. Early last year, Krasner shelved his retail theft policy, ending the order of classifying retail thefts of less than $500 as summary offenses, which precipitated a massive drop in retail theft arrests. Furthermore, in June of the same year, those arrested for retail theft were made ineligible for the diversion program that funnels offenders into non-incarceration alternatives. These policies, outcomes aside, represented a shift from the tough-on-crime approach of previous Democratic DAs like Lynn Abraham and Seth Williams. Abraham being the longest-running DA in the history of the city, who sought and obtained the death penalty so frequently that she was nicknamed the Queen of Death. She served 4 terms as DA from 1994 to 2009, when she retired. She was replaced by fellow Democrat Seth Williams, who continued her tough-on-crime policies, favored by the more conservative establishment wing of the Democratic Party. For the past 8 years, this wing lost ground in Philadelphia to the quote-unquote progressives and are now fighting to regain control. They've been preparing for this fight even before Dugin emerged as a clear candidate. At the time of his talks with the quote-unquote brokers of the city, Dugin was not the only person the establishment wing of the party were coalescing around. At least half a dozen others at the time were either explicitly stating their intention to run or were rumored to be considering it. This included people like former city council member Derek Green, state representative Jared Solomon, attorney and former head of public defenders Keir Bradford Gray, and former prosecutor Carlos Vega. Vega had run against Krasner previously in 2001 on a tough-on-crime platform, but ultimately failed to win the Democratic primary. After Dugin's announcement, though, all were reported to no longer be seeking backers. And why would they, since the party wing had now found their candidate in Dugin? Social democracy, of which progressives like Krasner are a manifestation of, has long been a trusted tool of the ruling class to maintain their domination over the working people. It lies to the working class promising a more humane capitalism as the solution to their problems, when in reality, only the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and construction of socialism-communism will solve their problems. The fact is that no amount of reforms will change the character of the legal system in the United States. It is a system built by and for the capitalist class, the class of business owners, to further their class interest, and this is reflected in the bourgeois character of the law in our country. The law, in expressing the interest and will of the capitalists, serves the monopolies and is constantly used against working people. In particular, the law safeguards private ownership over the means of production and legalizes the exploitation of the working class as well as the oppression of workers. This farce is made obvious when time after time the wealthy fail to be brought to justice for their crimes unless they affect other capitalists. Sure, they'll imprison the CEO of Enron for 24 years for stealing from his fellow capitalists through the company's fraud, but when Norfolk Southern, through their profit-seeking corner cutting, derails one of their trains, making large swaths of East Palestine uninhabitable and otherwise endangering the lives of working people, not one arrest is made. All that the working people, many of whom were made sick as a direct result, are entitled to, according to the courts, is a settlement of up to $24,000 per person, with many slated to not receive even this much. A total settlement of $600 million, which amounts to less than 7.5% of the yearly profit of the company, is what the lives and health of a whole city are worth in the eyes of the law. This is the kind of barbarity that passes for justice under capitalism. Progressives like Krasner promise that all that is needed for change to occur, for the boot of capital to be taken off of our necks, is for the election of the right individuals who will implement the right reforms, ignoring the fact that this approach leaves the capitalist class in power. It leaves the bourgeois state intact, and in this way ensures that any reforms will, sooner or later, be repealed. Regardless of the level of sincerity in their beliefs, Social Democrats will never be able to offer the workers more than watered-down reforms that leave power in the hands of the class enemy and thus preserve the exploitative system that is capitalism.
We'll be right back with more of New Worker News here on 92.9 FM WZML. But I want to remind you that every day throughout this country, workers are subjected to injustices and humiliation at the hands of the capitalists, from unpaid wages to mass layoffs. So we at New Worker understand the tyranny that the workplace is for workers. This is why we fight to expose these injustices. Only through militant organization of the working class can we stand toe-to-toe against the bosses. So this is why we want to hear from you, the listener. Are you having issues at work? Bosses cutting your hours or wages? Are you or your fellow workers' safety being thrown out of the window in the name of ever-increasing profit? Well, you are not alone. So reach out to us to tell your story. You can anonymously send an email or even a voice memo to cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that is cwpusa@protonmail.com. And check us out online at newworker.us. And now back to New Worker Radio, only here on 92.9 FM WZML.
I now pass it back to Manolis for the national news.
Donald Trump's new administration, after its inauguration on January 20th, is taking on the task of defending the interest of the bourgeoisie and the powerful U.S. monopolies in a period of greatly intensifying competition in many fields, and with its eyes focused on the main competitor that challenges the primacy of the United States in the imperialist system, that is, China. The Trump administration, as everything indicates, will attempt a major reshuffle of the deck on all fronts. The hearings of the proposed administration members these days are typical. The 53-year-old Republican Senator Marco Rubio is taking over as Secretary of State, has promised to pursue a foreign policy that will focus on U.S. interests. The prominent member of the anti-Cuban mafia, in addition to his consistent positions against the Cuban Revolution, focused particularly on the intensification of international competition, with China clearly as the first rival. He said characteristically that he sees a world in chaos where it will not be easy to restore order, and the United States must change course to avoid dependence on China and to do more to discourage Beijing from invading Taiwan. Treasury Secretary candidate Scott Bessent, 62, stated he is 100% in favor of imposing tougher sanctions on Russia if ordered to do so by Trump. He believes the sanctions imposed by the Biden administration on Russia were not high enough. Bessent called the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine one of the greatest he has seen in his lifetime, and said he would do everything he could in his new position to help end the war as soon as possible. Amid Bessent's testimony, Bloomberg predicts that the Trump administration is planning a broad sanction strategy to facilitate a diplomatic deal between Russia and Ukraine in the coming months, while also putting pressure on Iran and Venezuela. The nominee for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, a 44-year-old former major and former Fox News anchor who is expected to promote the same aggressive policy, something everyone knows, was confronted by Democratic senators with references to his past and his involvement in alcohol and drug adventures. He himself spoke of a widespread reorganization of the Pentagon. Pam Bondi, 59, for the Department of Justice, who was Florida's Attorney General between 2011 and 2019, and had supported Donald Trump when he was impeached in the Senate in 2019, assured that there will never be a list of enemies in the Department of Justice and that she will never politicize the office. Referring to the law for the mandatory sale of TikTok application or its ban in the United States, she refused to clarify whether she would implement it, arguing that the case is still pending in the courts. Referring to the granting of pardons to those accused of the evasion of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, Body said that she would examine each case individually if asked. Bloomberg reported yesterday that Trump's administration is planning a broad sanctions strategy to facilitate a diplomatic deal between Russia and Ukraine in the coming months, while also putting pressure on Iran and Venezuela. The network estimates that there is a general consensus among Trump's top advisors to return to a full maximum pressure strategy targeting Iran, starting with a major sanctions package targeting key players in the oil industry. A typical example is the case of the 60-year-old incoming Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, who is also the CEO of the energy company Liberty Energy. Wright believes that fossil fuels are the key to ending global poverty, which he considers a bigger problem than the distant threat of climate change. He also supports some alternatives to fossil fuels, such as small nuclear power reactors, which are not yet commercially available, and geothermal energy. He has also criticized solar and wind energy as inadequate. He is expected to resign from Liberty once his candidacy is confirmed. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who is slated to be the Department of Homeland Security, is also expected to testify before the committee. Of great interest is the case of the audits required for the case of the richest billionaire in the world, Elon Musk, who will take over, together with another billionaire, Vivek Ramaswamy, the new Ministry of Government Efficiency. The new government has also warned of deportations of 11 million immigrants and the closing of borders, significant tariffs on imported goods, not only from competing countries such as China, but also from close allies such as EU countries and the United Kingdom, Canada, and Mexico. At the same time, large tax breaks are being planned for large, domestic and foreign, capital operating in the United States, as well as a reduction in government spending and a shrinkage of the so-called deep state, in the context of a broader restructuring and reduction of a multitude of state and public services, and even the Army, with the exception of the military industry sector, which remains permanently benefited. The new government's plans also include reforms in healthcare and food processing sectors against the backdrop of Robert F. Kennedy's ministerial appointment, as well as a premium for oil and natural gas production at the expense of the so-called green monopolies favored by the Biden government. Indicative of the great bargain that will take place, however, is a telephone conversation that Trump had with Chinese President Xi Jinping, stating that he discussed trade with him, also referring to the case with the social networking site TikTok. As reported, their phone call was so-called very good for both China and the United States, and it was assured that the two of them will solve a lot of problems together. In other news, large corporations continue to donate millions to Trump and vie for his influence. Before Donald Trump was sworn in for a second term as U.S. president, millions of dollars flowed and continue to flow in his direction, donated by large corporations. Multi-billionaire Elon Musk, from Tesla, SpaceX, and X, alone donated $260 million in December. Musk has now officially risen to become Trump's advisor and is thus openly involved in U.S. politics. But even after the successful election, the owners and CEOs of monopolies such as Apple, Amazon, Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Uber donated large sums to Trump. They are vying for a place under the sun during Trump's inauguration ceremony. According to ABC News and the New York Times, Trump has already raised $170 million for this. The sum could grow to over $200 million. Overall, it was and is mainly the companies from the tech, finance, and energy sectors that are supporting Trump, namely almost 70% of the total cash flow for the election campaign. The swearing-in ceremony is of great interest to representatives of the U.S. capitalist class. If donations exceed $1 million, they will be granted access to several events. They will be invited to a dinner with Donald Trump and his wife Melania, as well as to a meal with future Vice President James David Vance and his wife Yusha. Because the amount of donations is so high, seats at the swearing-in ceremony itself are already scarce and are not guaranteed even with a donation of $1 million. The top representatives of monopoly capital in the USA are vying for a place at Trump's table in order to secure influence there. Trump's government, as stubborn and sometimes unpredictable as it may be, will be a government of capital. It was only made possible by the generous donations made by corporations during the election cycle. In this respect, the monopoly masters will not just beg for little sweets at dinner with Trump like subordinates. They will also have a very strong negotiating position. In this respect, these dinners, which the Washington Post describes as a key moment for the lobbying industry, will establish the first firm framework for the administration of U.S. imperialism in the coming term. The United States is experiencing a homelessness crisis. Within a year, the number of people without a permanent home rose by a shocking 18%, according to recent reports from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. With 771,480 homeless people in 2024, a new record high has been reached, and this in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The dramatic figures are not just the result of short-term economic fluctuations, but they shed a harsh light on the structural weaknesses of the capitalist system. High inflation, rising property prices, and a lack of affordable housing particularly affect the already disadvantaged in society. Added to this are natural disasters, which are becoming more frequent and more devastating in the context of climate change. However, these factors are only the tip of the iceberg. A closer look shows that social inequality is deeply embedded in the structures of the U.S. economy and society. African Americans are particularly affected, accounting for 32% of the homeless despite making up 12% of the population. This disproportion is no coincidence, but the result of historical and systemic discrimination that capitalism takes advantage of, and that is still reflected in housing and labor markets today. The crisis is hitting the most vulnerable particularly hard. The number of homeless children has increased by 33%. According to data, there are around 150,000 children in the USA without a permanent home, an alarming situation in a country that prides itself on upholding equal opportunities and children's rights. These children often live in unsafe, overcrowded emergency shelters or on the streets, which has a serious impact on their education, health, and future prospects. If everyone is supposedly the master of their own destiny, many fall victim to the system that is geared towards profit. The housing shortage is exacerbated by the constantly rising real estate prices and interest rates. The average age for buying a home is now 38 years old, a clear sign that the housing market has become unaffordable for many because, unlike some European countries, the USA is a classic owner-occupier society, not a renter. Young people are particularly affected and often find themselves in an endless spiral of high rents and stagnating wages, with no prospect of ownership or financial security. The effects of pandemic policies are further exacerbating the crisis. Programs introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic to prevent homelessness have now expired, a move that has plunged many people into uncertainty. At the same time, there is a lack of political will to take comprehensive measures against the crisis. Instead, resources are often channeled into profit-driven projects, while in the United States too, the working class has to pay for the crises. This homelessness crisis is not an inevitable natural disaster. It is the direct result of an economic system that is focused on maximizing profits rather than human needs. Capitalism creates a society in which basic needs like housing become luxuries, accessible only to those who can afford them. At the same time, the system reinforces existing inequalities. In other national news, around a week after the devastating fires broke out in Los Angeles, the first residents are allowed to return home to the fire areas. However, the number of victims has continued to rise. At least 27 people have died in the fires. Search teams are still looking over the region for human remains. The number is expected to rise. Residents are still being kept away from some areas because bodies are suspected to be there or because it is still too dangerous to return, for example, because of mudslides or toxic waste lying around. Teams from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, began inspections and collection of pesticides, fuels, lithium batteries, and other hazardous substances from the mountains of debris, materials that, as they decompose, release substances that are particularly dangerous to humans and the environment. It is estimated that around 12,000 buildings were destroyed in the fires. 180,000 people had to temporarily leave their homes. Electricity, gas, and sewage lines were all destroyed. And while the fire itself made no distinction between rich and poor and destroyed numerous mansions, the already massive inequality in Los Angeles is expected to grow after the fires. While the rich will be able to afford to rebuild their homes, many people with lower incomes are at risk of permanent displacement from their homes. This trend, already emerging in Los Angeles, is also evidenced by several past examples in California. In late 2018, for example, the town of Paradise, California, was completely destroyed by a wildfire, with 90% of its buildings burning down. 5 years after the fire, only about a third of the 27,000 residents who lived in the town before the fire had returned, and the average price of a home rose from $236,000 to $440,000. As a result, many victims of the fires were permanently displaced, and the town has begun to attract people from wealthier regions such as the Bay Area. The authorities recommended patience, quote, for at least another week to residents waiting to return to their homes, expressing fears of landslides and exposure to toxic waste, and noting that there may be more victims, which is why these recommendations to the displaced are being maintained. There are already reports that landlords in Los Angeles are massively increasing apartment prices, even though this is prohibited in California during an official state of emergency. The concern of Californian residents this past week due to the large fire that broke out at the industrial facilities of a large lithium battery plant in the south of the state, which has even led to an evacuation orders for thousands of residents. The fire broke out at the Moss Landing Power Plant, a storage facility for millions of lithium batteries, with authorities issuing orders to close schools and confine residents to their home. Reuters reported that at least 40% of the building had been engulfed in flames. The Moss Landing Power Plant is located about 124 kilometers south of San Francisco and belongs to the energy giant Vistra Energy, based in Texas. It is important to understand that extinguishing a fire where lithium batteries are, which are widely used in recent areas to store electricity from renewable sources such as solar energy, are burning, is a particularly complex and even difficult matter. For its part, the Vistra Group claimed in a statement that all personnel were safely evacuated and that the cause of the fire has not yet been determined, but the investigation will begin once the fire is extinguished. The fires of Los Angeles demonstrate once again the absence of comprehensive planning for the protection of both the environment and human life in the event of major natural disasters, which, although the civil authorities are inclined to all sorts of things, do not explain why the abundant and modern scientific knowledge and progress are not utilized to deal with them.
And now we turn it over to John Paul with international news.
The ceasefire in Palestine. On 7th of October 2023, Hamas fighters launched Operation Al-Aqsa Flood against Israel, following years of provocation, starvation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. The fighters quickly broke through the walls fencing in Gaza's population and seized Israeli territory. Israel swiftly responded with a genocidal campaign on the entirety of Gaza, regaining lost territory within weeks. The IDF unleashed a hellish bombing campaign and occupation of Gaza for the next 15 months. The world has since watched in utter horror as the Palestinians in Gaza have been mercilessly slaughtered by Israel. Their land seized, their homes destroyed, their families buried under mountains of rubble. The war has seen no reprieve for a people deprived of all freedoms. Since the outbreak of this genocidal war in Gaza, Israel has murdered nearly 50,000 Palestinians, with many more still buried under the rubble. Per the Associated Press, 90% of Gaza's population of 2.1 million people have been displaced by the murderous campaign. Roughly 70% of Gaza's infrastructure has been damaged or lies in ruins. Hospitals, schools, homes, energy infrastructure, and so much more are now scattered heaps of rubble strewn throughout the Gaza Strip in a nightmarish landscape. In a report from the United Nations, it is estimated that Gaza's development has been set back by 70 years. The Palestinian people have been violently deprived of every basic aspect of a dignified human existence, left with tens of billions of dollars worth of repairs and reconstruction to be done. The Communist Workers' Platform USA recognizes that the struggle for a free Palestine is linked to the fight for socialism communism in our country. The United States government has backed this genocide to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in weapons and supplies to the IDF. The U.S. provided $18 billion worth of military supplies in the year after October 7th. By August 2024, the U.S. had provided 50,000 tons of munitions to Israel, produced off the backs of American workers and for the profit of the arms manufacturing monopolies, to be used on the helpless people of Gaza. U.S. bombs and U.S. tax dollars have rained hell over Gaza for 15 horrific months. The heroic resistance of the Palestinians in Gaza has endured through this horrific chapter. Despite the pressure of multiple imperialist powers, the Palestinians have maintained their resistance. Hamas and Israel have signed a ceasefire agreement. Both sides have approved the terms and provisions of the deal. The provisions of the deal are as follows. 1. Initial 6-week ceasefire. A temporary cessation of hostilities commenced on 19th of January 2025, set to last for 6 weeks. During these 6 weeks, both Israel and Hamas are to cease military operations to facilitate the flow of aid into Gaza and lay the ground for subsequent phases of the ceasefire. Hamas agreed to release 33 of their Israeli hostages taken during the Al-Aqsa flood operation. In exchange, Israel has committed to releasing approximately 1,900 of the Palestinian hostages that they have held. Humanitarian aid and reconstruction. The ceasefire facilitates the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, addressing critical shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. 4. Israeli military withdrawal. Israel has agreed to a phased withdrawal of its forces from the Gaza Strip during the ceasefire period. The withdrawal aims to facilitate the return of displaced Palestinians to their homes. Israel has already violated the ceasefire, with Israel delaying the implementation Sunday morning to demand a list of hostages from Hamas. Disturbingly, a 15-year-old Palestinian boy was killed by the IDF, who then fired on the Gazans attempting to retrieve his body from the street. While the ceasefire may now be in place, the conflict has not concluded. Israel continues to occupy large swaths of Gaza and is turning its greedy eyes on the West Bank. Palestinians in Gaza lived in a virtual concentration camp before October 7th. Now, there's a great pile of ash. Gaza will rebuild. Palestine will continue to fight for their freedom. The working class in the USA stands in firm solidarity with the people of Palestine. With the ideological direction of the Communist Party, we can put our solidarity into practice. The U.S. sanctions the Sudanese RSF. The civil war between rival factions of the Sudanese military has raged for almost 2 full years. Since April 2023, this devastating conflict between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, has wreaked havoc on the country, leaving millions destitute and famine conditions in large swaths of the territory. This war has drawn in imperialist powers such as the UAE and Russia to extend their own interests over the heads of the entire people of Sudan. Casualty figures range widely, between 150,000 to 500,000. Per the UN Refugee Agency, over 8 million Sudanese people have been internally displaced. At the heart of this tragedy is the RSF, a paramilitary force with roots in the infamous Janjaweed militias. They are the force responsible for the 2019 Khartoum massacre that saw hundreds of Sudanese protesters gunned down and other violence perpetrated on them. Just this month, the United States has labeled the RSF's actions as genocide, imposing sanctions on RSF leader General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, commonly known as Hamedi, and companies in the UAE that fund the RSF. But let us ask, is this a genuine pursuit of justice on the part of the US, or simply a strategic move in the chess game of their imperialist designs? The United States sheds crocodile tears over Sudan, while seeking nothing more than to counter the competing powers. Meanwhile, the UAE profits handsomely from arms sales to both sides, ensuring that the fires of war continue to burn while capital flows uninterrupted into their coffers. Russia, too, is entangled in this bloody affair. The mercenary Wagner Group has reportedly supplied arms and resources to Sudan's military government. Russia seeks the gold mining in Sudan, which Wagner Group has helped to safeguard. Sudan's gold allows Russian monopolies such as M Invest to circumvent sanctions imposed by the US following the invasion of Ukraine. The workers in Sudan are caught in the crossfire of militarism and imperialism. The capitalist imperialist system has robbed them of their food, their safety, their lives. A new Sudan cannot arise while capitalists, foreign and domestic, continue to exploit its resources and its labor. The United States, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates and others have no interest in peace. They seek only control and profit for their own monopolies. The CWP USA stands in solidarity with Sudan's workers and speaks to all workers who dream of a world free of domination and exploitation. Only socialism can bring lasting peace to Sudan and to the world.
You've been listening to a presentation of New Worker Radio, heard only here on 92.9 FM WZML. Once again, the email to get in touch with the Communist Workers Platform is cwpusa@protonmail.com. You can also find past episodes of New Worker Radio on YouTube. Just search for New Worker TV. This is 92.9 FM WZML, proudly the home of New Worker Radio. News and information from a pro-labor, working-class, anti-billionaire point of view.